story also allows us and helps us to find our way in the cosmos, to find our way in the world, in our life. And there's a modern physicist, Brian Swim, who says, the universe is not a collection of objects, it's a communion of subjects. In other words, all that exists in the cosmos is part of one story. We're all subjects in the same story. We're in the same story as the leaves that fall in this time of year. We're in the same story as the birds who are flying south. The same story as the young baby being born in the jungles of Africa at this very moment. And we're in the same story as the man walking down the street in Newark, New Jersey. It's all one story. And storytelling helps us to recognize our place within that story, helps us to see where we fit in the world. And we really can't understand our life. We really can't understand the cosmos without our understanding of the story that's unfolding around us. If we were born tomorrow morning, and it was a sunny, clear day with a blue sky, and we crawled outside, we were very advanced little children, and we crawled outside and we looked up at the sky and we'd say, why, the sky is blue, and it has white clouds, and there's a bright sun shining. But if we crawled back out that night and we looked up at the sky, we'd say, wow, it's full of stars. But in the daytime, we can't see the stars because there's nothing to relate them to. We can't understand that the stars even exist without the darkness that shows the story of the stars. And it's true with all our life. We can't understand anything that happens in our life without that which it's related to. In other words, we can't understand our place in the cosmos without the story that unfolds around us. Thousands of years, 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, on a shelf, an outcropping on Vulture Peak in India, Avalokiteshvara, who was an avatar of the Buddha, gathered all his disciples around him, including the animals and the spirits and the entities, for his teaching. And the first question that was asked of him was, how do we become wise? How do we follow the path of wisdom? How do we live a full life as a human being? And Avalokiteshvara said, the first thing to understand is that there's no such thing as inherent reality. Nothing exists outside of relationship, whether it's thoughts or physical aspects or emotions. None of it exists or is understandable outside its relationships. And that's the power and beauty that storytelling and story brings us. It brings us a relationship and a way to understand our life and our path. It helps us to see this mystery of life that's unfolding around us. And I've been very lucky in the last almost 4 years now to spend a lot of time with my teacher. And it's not unusual because she's my granddaughter. And last year, when she was a little over 2, she and I were sitting on the sofa together, and I could tell she was thinking because she was quiet and she was had a serious face. And she has beautiful blonde curly hair and bright shining blue eyes, and she was sitting seriously. And she turned to me and she said, Biff, and she always says that when she has something serious to say. She said, Biff, it's time for me to stop having Om. And when she says Om, she doesn't mean what we mean. She means nursing. She said, it's time for me to stop nursing, but she said, it's time for me to stop having Om. She said, I need to grow up. But she sat for a minute, and then she said, but you know, I like this. And she indicated herself. She said, I like this. And then there was a pause, and I didn't say anything, and I was watching, and I could tell she's thinking again. She said, Biff, there's a mystery here, and I'm going to find out what it is. And she got down off the sofa and she walked outside, and I, of course, was sitting there as we do when our teacher gives us a great truth and we don't know what to do with it. And I'm just sitting there. And it was so beautiful because, as Swamiji just said, I can see so clearly in her relationship with God, her relationship with what went before. And now she's trying to understand the new story that she's in. But it's a beautiful mystery to her. She says, there's a mystery, Biff, and I'm going to find out what it is. So when I come back next year, if she's found out, I'll let you know. I won't keep it a secret, I promise. So when I think of stories, some of my favorite stories are fairy tales. And we often think of fairy tales as stories for children, but they're really not. They were originally the teaching stories of the cultures that they were told within. And they were told to all age groups. And what I find so beautiful about fairy tales, as opposed to myths and some other stories, is that they've been told so often that the personal aspects, or you could say the idiosyncratic aspects of them, has fallen away. So they now, after years and years of being told, hold a real universal truth without the personal aspects of the storyteller. And fairy tales, and all stories, even the stories of our everyday life, whether the story of us going to the grocery store, or getting up in the morning, or doing our practice, all these stories can be seen really as having three aspects to them, three different characteristics. And we can say that there are youth stories, and there are midlife stories, and there are elder stories. And each of these type of stories has a really different focus. And the youth stories are these stories that speak about triumphing, about victory, about independence. And probably over 75% of fairy tales are youth stories. And these stories are about how do we establish ourselves in the world? How do we overcome the obstacles? How do we differentiate ourselves from our parents and from our society that isn't serving us? And these stories are interesting. And they're beautiful stories. And from my point of view, they're young stories. They're about doing something and getting where. And they're very necessary. And these stories, whether they're youth, midlife, or elder, weave their way through our life. But we don't just have youth stories when we're young. They come in later, and sometimes the elder stories and the midlife stories weave their way along. But where my real interest, or what I think more about, are the midlife and the elder stories. And for me, this is where the world and our practices need to move. And the midlife stories are the stories that don't talk about victory and independence. They talk about interdependence, and they talk about adaptation. The youth stories talk about how can we use magic and power, how can we pull the sword from the stone, how can we kiss the princess and have her change into something else, or the frog. But the midlife stories are different, and they start to ask the question, what has real heart and meaning for us in our lives? How do we express what's really true for us in our life? And Joseph Campbell says, as we get to the top of the ladder, as he expresses it, we climb this ladder we're always trying to get the right job and be the right person and do the right yoga posture and be able to do the stand on one hand and with our head, whatever. I haven't practiced hatha yoga for a while, so I don't know what you guys actually do. But as Joseph Campbell says, at some point we get to the top of the ladder and we find out it's up against the wrong wall. All these things we've worked for, all these things that we thought would bring us joy and satisfaction, now we realize maybe don't have heart and meaning for us. And this is the time of transformation. This is the time when we begin to adopt and we begin to transform those things which are no longer serving us, those stories that are no longer serving us. So let me tell you one of my favorite midlife stories. And this is an old story from Eastern Europe, I believe. And it's called The Telltale. Once upon a time, a long, long time ago, in a little house in the middle of the forest, lived a man and his wife. And the man was a woodcutter, and every day he went into the woods to cut firewood. And every evening he'd bring the firewood back, and he'd stack it in his woodshed, and he'd lean his axe up against the wall, and he'd go back to his house across his dooryard. And every week he'd go to town and he'd sell the firewood, and he'd make just enough money so his wife and he could eat, could just barely survive. But one day he filled his wheelbarrow early, and he got home early. And he stacked the wood, and he put his axe against the wall of his woodshed, and he started back across the dooryard to his house. But he heard some voices. And so he snuck up to the window and he looked in. And there at the dining room table was his wife. And across the table from her was the pawnbroker, the richest merchant in the town. And they had a bottle of wine and a plate of cakes, and they were gazing into each other's eyes and giggling. And the woodcutter became incensed, and he ran back to his woodshed, and he grabbed his axe, and he started back to the house, determined to murder them both. But as he got towards the house, he began to think, and he sat down on a stump. And he thought, if I do this, I'm going to lose my wife, and I really love her, and I'm going to end up in prison. And as he was thinking, he looked down, and there on the ground was a piece of wood about the size of his hand, and it was quite thin. It was a shaving from where he'd split wood. And it had a knot hole about the size of a quarter in it. And he picked it up, and he started back towards his house. But this time he made all kinds of noise. He was singing and whistling to make sure his wife and the pawnbroker could hear him. But before he got to the house, he ran quietly and looked in the window again, just in time to see his wife spring up in concern and fear. And she grabbed the bottle of wine, and she looked around a place to hide it, because there was only one door, and the woodcutter was headed for him. And so she went to the sink, and she moved some bottles, and she placed it there and covered it up. And then she grabbed the plate of cookies, and she looked around desperately, and she put it way up on a shelf by the door. But the pawnbroker was still sitting there, not knowing what to do. But there was a big chest in the corner that was empty. It had been there for years. And so she opened them, she shoved the pawnbroker in. She said, "Shut up and get in there," and she shut the lid. Just then the door opened, and the woodcutter came in. And he was smiling and whistling, holding this piece of wood. And his wife said, "Husband, why are you home so early?" And he said, "Oh, the most wonderful thing has happened to me. I met the spirit of the forest, and he gave me this magic telltale. And he told me, with this, I can find anything that's lost." And she said, and she was a little bit nervous, and she said, oh, husband, sit down, and I'll fix you a nice dinner. And he said, I've had such a beautiful day. I'd love a glass of wine. Do we have any wine? "No, husband," she said, we're too poor for wine except on the holidays." And he said, "Well, wait a minute." And he took the telltale, and he looked through the knothole, and he looked up at the ceiling and along, and finally he came to the place under the sink, and he moved the bottles aside, and he took out the bottle of wine. And he said, "Wow, this is wonderful." And he poured himself a glass and sat at the table and sipped at it, sighing contentedly. And his wife said, "I'll fix your supper." He said, "You know what goes really nicely with wine? There's some cakes. Do we have any cakes?" "No," she said, "Husband, we're too poor for cakes except at the holidays." "Oh, wait," he said. And he took the telltale, and he looked up and around, and finally he came to the shelf by the door, and he reached up, and sure enough, there was a plate of cakes. And he sat, and he ate a cake and drank some wine. And he said, "You know what, wife? I think there's something we've forgotten, that we've lost in this house." And she, by now, was turned pale, and she's shaking a little bit. She's, no, husband, don't worry. Just sit down and have some wine. I'll fix your dinner. And he said, no, no. And he took the telltale. He looked all around, and finally he came to the trunk in the corner of the room. And being a big, strong man, he grabbed the trunk and he threw it up on his shoulder, and he marched into town, right to the store of the pawnbroker. And he slammed it down on the floor, and he said to the pawnbroker's assistant, who was there, I want 100 gold coins for this chest. And that was a fortune, enough for a family to live for lifetimes. And the pawnbroker's assistant said, that's ridiculous. It's not worth 2 copper pennies. And the woodcutter said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll go outside and smoke my pipe, and you think about it. And when I come back in, you let me know. So he did. And as soon as the door shut, there was a voice from the chest, pay the man. And the pawnbroker's assistant looked around. And again, there was a voice, pay the man. And he recognized the voice of his master. Just then, the door opened. And the woodcutter came in and said, what did you decide? Well, he said, oh, here's your 100 gold coins. So the woodcutter went home, and he hung the telltale up on the wall, and he and his wife lived in peace and abundance for the rest of their days. So this is a beautiful reminder that there comes a time when the patterns, the behavior that has seemed so important in our life no longer serves us. That our wisdom can allow us to see what really has heart and meaning in our life, and to begin to let go of the stories that no longer serve us and no longer have heart for us. And I know in my practice that has happened a number of times when I've recognized, you know what, this struggle or this practice or this way of doing things doesn't have heart and meaning for me anymore. And now it's time to transition, to transform that. And I also know that every day when I walk down the street or whatever I do, there's always a chance for me to shift any patterns that aren't serving me and that aren't serving the world. There's always time for us to sit on that stump and say, you know what? There's a different way for me to be in the world. There's a different way for me to practice. And these are the midlife stories. These are the invitations to ask for a society and for us as practitioners or teachers to ask what really is true, what really has heart and meaning. And then we come to the elder stories. And the elder stories say, now what are you going to do? Now all this work you've done, all the wisdom you've gathered, all the perspective you've gained in your life, what is it for? What are you going to do now? And I'll tell you an elder story. And it's a story from Italy, and it's called The Shining Fish. Once upon a time, many, many years ago, there was a little cottage that sat between the sea and the forest. And in that cottage lived an old man and his wife. And they'd had a very hard life. Their children had died and left them alone and destitute. They barely got by. And every day he went into the woods to collect firewood, which he would sell every day. And every day they'd have just a few pennies to buy a little bit of food, just to live, just to get by. But one day when he was in the woods, he met a man with a long gray beard. And the man with the long gray beard said, I know how hard your life is, and I'd like to help you. And he took a little leather bag and he gave it to the old man. And the old man opened it and it was full of gold coins, and he was so shocked that he fainted dead away. And when he awoke, the man with the long gray beard was gone. So he started back to his house. But on the way, he began to think, and he said to himself, you know, if I give this gold to my wife, I think she might squander it. So it was late, and he hid it under a pile of manure by the front door. And he went in and went to sleep. And he woke up in the morning, and to the smell of sausages frying. And he went downstairs, and his wife was cooking a beautiful breakfast. And he said, "Wife, where did we get the money for these beautiful sausages?" And she said, "Oh, husband, you didn't give me any money from your wood last night, so I sold a pile of manure that was in the yard." And he said, "Oh, no," he said. And slowly he trudged back into the woods, picking up sticks to sell. But soon the man with the long gray beard appeared again. And he laughed and he said, "I know what happened to the last gold, but I still want to help you." And he gave him another bag of gold. So the old man headed home, but the same thought occurred to him. You know what? If I give this to my wife, she might spend it all and waste it. So he hid it under a pile of ashes next to the door. And he was late, so he went to bed. And guess what? When he woke up in the morning, there was a smell of sausages cooking. And he said to his wife, "Wife, where'd you get the money to buy the sausages?" "Well," she said, "last night you didn't bring me any money from the woods, so I sold a pile of ashes that was by the door." And he ran into the woods, pulling on his hair. He couldn't believe it. And dejectedly, he was picking up sticks again. But then the man with the long white beard appeared. And he said, "I guess you're not destined to be wealthy, but I still want to help you." And he gave him a bag of 12 frogs. And he said, "Take these frogs to the market and sell them. And with the money, get the biggest fish you can afford. Don't get sausages. Don't get pastries. Get the biggest fish you can afford." So the old man went to the market and he sold the frogs. And he had the money and he started looking at the sausages. And he left them, and then he looked at the pastries. And finally said, "No, I'm going to do what the man in the long white beard told me to do." So he bought the biggest fish he could find. And it was getting late, and when he got home, it was almost dark. So instead of cleaning and eating the fish, he hung it in the rafters facing the sea, and he went to bed. And in the middle of the night, a storm happened. And the wind was blowing, and the rain was thrashing down, and the waves were crashing on the sea. And in the middle of the night, there was a pounding on the door. And he woke up and he opened the door, and it was 5 young fishermen. And they were dancing and laughing, and they said, "Thank you, thank you." And he said, "For what? What have I done?" And they said, "We were lost at sea, and we couldn't see the way back to land. And we saw that bright light that you had hanging in the rafters." And he looked over, and the fish he had hung was glowing. It was shining like a lighthouse. And it had guided the young fisherman back to shore. And from that day on, every evening he hung the fish in the rafters. And every morning the young fishermen came and they gave them fish. And for the rest of their lives, the old man and his wife lived in abundance and in peace and dignity till the end of their days. The end. So this is a story that's filled with these beautiful symbolisms, of course. You know, we start with the little house that lies between the sea and the forest, between the unconscious and the conscious. It lets us know that this possibility of transformation, transcendence is there. And then this process starts. And the old man, we could say the old man and his wife, of course, are two parts of one person. And so he receives this gold, the basest of desires, the gold representing the earthly desires. And he receives it, but he doesn't trust his own greed. He doesn't trust himself. So he buries it under the manure. And again, the next day he still doesn't trust himself. He doesn't trust his greed or his intentions. So he buries it under the ashes. So he begins to purify these earthly desires by putting them through the manure and then through the ashes, which is the result of the burning. So he begins to purify his earthly desires and his self. And then finally he begins to trust himself. And he does what the man in the long beard asks him to do. And of course, the man in the long beard, we could say, is God or his love or his internal teacher. He finally begins to trust that. And in fact, he goes so far as to hang the fish up in the rafters. And of course, we know that by the sea and the seagulls and everything else, but he trusts that things will be all right. And by doing that, he comes to a place of abundance, a place of understanding what's enough in his life. He no longer wants gold, he just wants enough. And of course, abundance is the gateway to equanimity, which opens to compassion and loving kindness. But it starts with the understanding of abundance, or can start with the understanding of abundance. And this understanding of abundance, rather than the understanding of need and striving in the youth stories, begins to come to the elder stories. But what's so beautiful to me about this story is it's telling us why we're doing our practices. Why are we purifying ourselves? Why are we taking the gold and bearing it? For one reason only, and that is to be able to hang that shining light in the rafters. We do our practices so that we can be a guide for those who need our guidance. That we can be a guide for those stuck out in the sea that don't know their way back to shore. And it's time for us to move into our elder stories as a society, as a race. It's time for us to let go of these youth stories of striving and begin to transform through the stories of midlife, and finally to transcend those desires and those needs, and to show up as people who can be present and be guides to those who need our help. And it's such a privilege for me to be here in a place where that's so much a part of the culture, to be an example and a guide to those who come after us. Thank you.